San Quentin in California, the weight of isolation. San Quentin State Prison sits on the edge of San Francisco Bay. From the outside, the prison appears almost still. Concrete walls, guard towers, razor wire tracing the perimeter. But inside the oldest housing units, the experience of incarceration is measured not by distance or geography, but by time and silence. East Block is one of the most recognizable structures inside San Quentin. Built in 1927, the 5-tier cell block was designed for a different era of incarceration. More than 90 years later, much of that original structure remains. Rows of narrow steel cells stacked above one another. Metal walkways suspended in open air. Concrete floors worn down by decades of movement. Each cell measures roughly 4 feet wide and about 10 feet deep. Inside, the physical environment rarely changes. A steel bunk bolted to the wall. A thin mattress. A stainless steel sink and toilet combination unit. The design allows little room for movement. In many units across the California prison system, incarcerated people spend most of the day inside spaces not much larger than a walk-in closet. Isolation is not unique to San Quentin. Across the United States, correctional systems have long relied on forms of restricted housing, sometimes called administrative segregation, disciplinary segregation, or solitary confinement. The terminology differs, but the underlying structure is similar. Extended periods of separation from the general population. Limited physical contact. Controlled movement. Restricted communication. California's prison system has been the subject of national scrutiny for its use of long-term isolation. In the early 2010s, investigations by journalists, civil rights organizations, and legal advocates documented individuals held in solitary housing units for years, sometimes decades. The issue eventually reached federal courts. In 2015, a landmark settlement in Ashker v. Governor of California forced the state to significantly reduce the use of indefinite solitary confinement. Before that agreement, some individuals had spent more than 20 years in isolation units within the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. The psychological consequences of such confinement had already been studied for decades. Research cited by the American Psychological Association and the National Commission on Correctional Health Care found consistent patterns. Extended isolation can produce measurable mental health effects. Difficulty concentrating, heightened anxiety, sleep disruption, hypersensitivity to sound, hallucinations in some cases. For individuals already living with mental illness, those symptoms can intensify. San Quentin itself has historically housed people under various forms of restricted movement. Some units operate under heightened supervision. Others are used for disciplinary separation. Movement is tightly structured. Meals arrive through metal slots. Communication with staff often happens through reinforced doors. Observation windows allow officers to monitor individuals without opening the cell. From a correctional management perspective, isolation is often described as a control mechanism, a way to contain violence, to separate individuals involved in conflict, or to enforce institutional rules. Correctional officers are responsible for maintaining that structure. Their authority inside the facility is both practical and legal. They control movement, cell doors, access to programs, and access to other people. Inside a prison environment, that authority operates within strict policy frameworks written by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. Those policies dictate when force may be used, how discipline must be documented, how incarcerated individuals must be monitored while confined. But written policy and daily practice do not always align perfectly. Over the past several decades, multiple investigations, including internal reviews, federal civil rights cases, and independent reporting, have examined allegations involving correctional staff across California prisons. Some of those cases involved excessive force. Others involved retaliation. And some involved misconduct that unfolded away from cameras or witnesses. At San Quentin, the physical layout of older cell blocks has long been part of that conversation. The architecture was built for surveillance, but it was not built for transparency. Narrow corridors, blind corners, steel walkways suspended several stories above the floor. Sound echoes in unpredictable ways. Movement can disappear behind a single closing door. For incarcerated individuals living inside these units, daily life is defined by repetition. Count times, meal deliveries, scheduled showers. Moments outside the cell, when permitted, are brief and structured. In isolation housing, those moments can be even more limited. The result is a rhythm of waiting. Waiting for doors to open. Waiting for the next scheduled movement. waiting for contact with another human voice. Former prisoners who spent extended time in solitary housing units have described the experience in court testimony and interviews with journalists. Some reported losing track of time. Others described counting footsteps in the corridor, listening for distant sounds, anything that might break the silence. Correctional officers working these units face a different reality. Long shifts, constant vigilance, the responsibility of maintaining order in an environment where tension can rise quickly. Inside prison systems across the United States, staff misconduct cases are statistically rare compared to the total number of daily interactions that occur between officers and incarcerated individuals. But when those cases do occur, they carry significant consequences. For the individuals involved, for the institution, and for the credibility of the system itself. San Quentin has been at the center of several such controversies over the years. Some were investigated internally. Others reached state or federal courts. The records of those cases, disciplinary findings, lawsuits, and investigative reporting, form part of the historical record surrounding one of California's most well-known prisons. This documentary examines those records, the policies that govern correctional authority, and the moments when that authority is alleged to have crossed the line. Inside institutions built on control, small decisions can carry enormous weight. A closed door, a delayed response, a use of force report written after the fact. Each of those moments exists inside a system designed to manage thousands of people through structure and restriction. But when that structure fails, the consequences can unfold in spaces where very few people are watching. San Quentin's walls have stood for more than 170 years. Inside them, the balance between order and accountability continues to be tested. San Quentin and California, allegations and accountability. Within California's prison system, mechanisms exist to investigate alleged misconduct by correctional officers. Internal affairs divisions, inmate grievance procedures, and state oversight bodies document and respond to complaints. At San Quentin, allegations against staff have ranged from inappropriate use of force to administrative lapses in supervision. Court records and investigative journalism provide insight into the ways these cases unfold. In 2013, a series of reports highlighted incidents in which officers were accused of retaliating against incarcerated individuals who filed grievances or pursued legal action. Documents obtained through public records requests indicate that these complaints often centered on minor procedural issues, cell assignments, movement schedules, or disciplinary write-ups, but escalated due to the imbalance of authority in restricted housing units. Other records include cases of excessive force. Internal reports show that officers sometimes used physical restraint beyond what was documented in policy. In several instances, these events led to civil rights lawsuits. Settlements and court judgments in such cases are public, providing verifiable evidence of institutional accountability failures. The procedures for addressing these incidents are complex. An allegation triggers a multi-step review process. First, an incident report is filed. Then, an internal investigation may be launched, often including interviews, video review, and examination of logs. The California Office of the Inspector General, external to the prison, sometimes conducts independent audits to ensure compliance with policy. Despite these layers, systemic limitations persist. Many incidents occur in spaces without constant camera coverage, leaving investigations reliant on written reports and recollections. Delays in processing complaints further complicate accountability. In several high-profile cases, federal oversight was required. Consent decrees and court monitoring became tools to enforce reforms. The Ashker case not only addressed prolonged isolation but also scrutinized the treatment of individuals within the control units and the conduct of staff overseeing them. Settlement terms mandated reduced time in isolation and improvements to grievance procedures, as verified by court documents and monitoring reports. Academic studies have analyzed patterns of misconduct in California prisons. Research published in the Journal of Correctional Healthcare highlights that environments with extreme restriction, limited oversight, and high-stress staff assignments correlate with a higher frequency of reported incidents. The data underscores the structural pressures inherent in facilities like San Quentin. Correctional officers, however, are rarely untrained or unsupervised. Policies emphasize professional conduct, use of force protocols, and documentation standards. Trainings are regular and refresher courses are mandated. Yet, even with policy in place, the lived reality of housing units can challenge those standards. Officers navigate tight corridors, multiple blind spots, and hundreds of daily interactions. Every decision, from when to open a cell door to how to respond to a complaint, can have immediate consequences for safety. Records from internal audits and lawsuits show that when these decisions exceed policy or deviate from procedure, the consequences extend beyond the individual officer. For incarcerated individuals, even minor procedural errors or abuses can exacerbate the psychological strain of confinement. Delays, restrictions, or perceived retaliation contribute to anxiety, sleep disruption, and other documented effects of long-term confinement. For the institution, failures in accountability can undermine public trust, invite litigation, and trigger federal oversight. In the past decade, San Quentin has faced scrutiny not only for historic overcrowding and prolonged isolation but also for patterns of misconduct that became publicly documented. Internal reports, settlement agreements, and state inspection findings provide a detailed, verifiable record of incidents in which staff crossed the line. These cases are not anecdotal. They are documented, reviewed, and, in some instances, adjudicated. They illustrate the complex interplay between authority, restriction, and oversight. Every documented incident reflects both a failure of procedure and the inherent tension in a system built on control. The majority of correctional officers perform their duties without incident. Yet the structure of the institution creates a high-stakes environment in which errors or misconduct, whether intentional or procedural, carry amplified consequences. In these administrative spaces, files and reports replace human interaction. Logs, incident forms, and grievance records become the evidence of what occurred behind locked doors. And while transparency mechanisms exist, the sheer scale and structure of the prison mean that much of daily life remains invisible to external scrutiny. This documentary examines those records and their implications. It traces how authority is exercised, how lines are crossed, and how accountability is enforced. San Quentin, like all prisons, is a system of rules and control. Within that system, documented misconduct offers insight into the fragile balance between institutional order and individual rights. It is a balance tested daily, often in silence, behind steel doors, and under fluorescent lights that flicker over empty corridors. Here, in the administrative offices and housing units alike, the record of human action, whether compliant or overstepping, exists in writing and occasionally in court. These records allow a rare glimpse into the consequences when correctional authority is exercised beyond policy. And they set the stage for understanding the next layer of San Quentin's institutional reality: how oversight or its absence shapes life inside the prison walls. Oversight in the shadows. Monitoring is central to control in a high-security prison. San Quentin employs multiple layers of oversight within its housing units. Cameras, count protocols, and logging systems track movement, communication, and behavior. Yet these measures offer only partial visibility. Surveillance cameras cover the corridors, exercise areas, and communal spaces, but blind spots remain. Individual cells, corners of walkways, and areas behind structural columns are difficult to monitor continuously. The data recorded is meticulous. Every door opening, cell check, and security count is logged. Incident reports are filed to document interactions that deviate from normal procedures. But the system is reactive rather than preventative. Cameras record events, they do not stop them. Logs capture incidents, they do not prevent them. Public records and investigative reporting have documented situations in which these oversight mechanisms failed to detect or deter misconduct. Some reports cite delayed response to grievances, miscommunication between staff, and gaps in real-time observation. Federal oversight has occasionally intervened. Monitors appointed by courts in cases like Ashker versus Governor of California provide independent assessments of conditions in control units, reviewing compliance with settlement agreements and monitoring use of force reports. Reports from these monitors are detailed. They track policy compliance, document deviations, and assess whether conditions of confinement meet legal and ethical standards. Despite these measures, internal reports indicate that incidents of misconduct, retaliation, or procedural error persist. Oversight can be limited by the physical environment of the prison, by staffing constraints, and by the sheer volume of daily operations. Interviews documented in court filings reveal that correctional staff are aware of these limitations. They describe balancing safety, security, and institutional mandates in an environment where authority must be exercised constantly. At the same time, incarcerated individuals are acutely aware of the same limitations. They understand which spaces are monitored, which procedures are recorded, and where gaps exist. These assessments are documented in grievances, testimony, and legal filings. Accountability in this environment depends on documentation and verification. Incident reports, grievance logs, and camera recordings form the backbone of any investigation into staff conduct. Yet each record is mediated by human judgment. The officer writing the report decides what details are relevant. The officer reviewing it interprets context. The observer assessing compliance in court or through federal oversight relies on these filtered accounts. This layered structure, authority exercised in real time, oversight applied after the fact, defines the reality of correctional operations. San Quentin has, over decades, experienced cases where these mechanisms intersected with misconduct. Disciplinary actions, settlements, and court findings provide public evidence of what happens when oversight succeeds or fails. One recurring theme emerges: structural power shapes every interaction. Officers control movement, communication, and access. Inmates depend on policy and procedure for fairness. When documentation is accurate and policies are enforced, order is maintained. When oversight is limited, lines can be crossed. Authority can be exercised beyond policy. And consequences, psychological, legal, and institutional, can ripple outward. Records confirm that even minor deviations in control, left unchecked, accumulate over time. A delayed meal, a missed count, or a procedural lapse may seem small in isolation. But in the context of prolonged confinement, restricted movement, and heightened surveillance, these deviations affect both safety and perception of fairness. Federal monitors, internal audits, and investigative journalists provide windows into these dynamics, yet much remains unseen. The physical and administrative architecture of San Quentin ensures that the lived experience of confinement is largely invisible to outsiders. Even with cameras and logs, much of the day-to-day reality is contained behind steel doors, in shadowed corridors, and in the quiet intervals between counts and movements. Oversight in these spaces is essential, but it is also inherently limited. And it is in these gaps, between policy and practice, between observation and reality, that documented cases of misconduct emerge. The records, court filings, and investigative reports form a trail of evidence that allows scrutiny. They show how authority can be exercised responsibly, and how it can be abused. They illustrate the stakes inherent in a system built on control, where one individual's actions can profoundly affect another's psychological and physical well-being. San Quentin, like other high-security prisons in California, operates in the shadow of its own architecture. Surveillance provides visibility. Logs provide accountability. Policy provides guidance. Yet the lived reality, inside cells, along corridors, and under the eyes of staff, remains partially obscured. And it is in this tension between control and oversight, visibility and invisibility, that the most consequential aspects of institutional life unfold. Here, authority is both necessary and fraught. Its exercise, documented or undocumented, shapes daily life inside California's most famous prison. And as this documentary will show, the consequences of crossing that line are measurable, recorded, and enduring. The human cost of crossing the line. Beyond policy and oversight, the consequences of authority exercised improperly are borne by the individuals living inside the cells. San Quentin's records, court filings, and investigative reporting provide repeated examples of how procedural violations, retaliatory acts, or excessive force can affect incarcerated individuals. One documented pattern involves delayed access to medical care. Inmates in administrative segregation often must submit written requests for routine or urgent medical attention. Internal audits and federal oversight reports confirm that in some cases, these requests were ignored or delayed, resulting in prolonged suffering. The Office of the Inspector General has cited instances where staff failed to follow protocol, creating unnecessary risk for those in isolation. Another consequence involves the use of force beyond policy. Court records show cases in which restraint devices, handcuffs, leg irons, or full-body restraints, were applied inconsistently, sometimes for extended periods without justification. Settlements in these cases, such as those recorded in state civil claims, indicate both acknowledgement of procedural violations and efforts to remediate institutional failure. Psychological effects of such incidents are significant. Extensive research conducted in California's prison system, including testimony from mental health professionals, links prolonged isolation and procedural abuse to anxiety, depression, and cognitive disruption. Court documents in the Ashker and Harris cases detail expert findings on the mental health consequences of extended segregation, noting patterns of emotional dysregulation and sleep disturbance. The system of control amplifies these effects. Inmates have no ability to remove themselves from the space. Every action of staff, cell door openings, movement orders, and routine checks, can directly affect daily life. Misuse of authority therefore carries heightened consequences. Retaliation is another documented risk. Internal investigations, legal filings, and investigative journalism recount instances in which inmates who submitted grievances or pursued legal claims experienced punitive measures, such as restricted yard time, loss of privileges, or reassignment to more restrictive housing. These measures, while sometimes framed as disciplinary action, were challenged in court and confirmed through official records. Correctional officers operate under stress and responsibility, yet these incidents highlight the imbalance of power inherent in restricted housing units. The authority to control movement, communication, and access to necessities carries the potential for misuse, intentional or otherwise. Even minor deviations from policy, an unscheduled cell search, a delayed meal tray, a misapplied disciplinary report, can escalate in high-stress conditions, leading to measurable harm. Internal audits and state reports frequently cite such cumulative effects as contributing to deteriorating mental and physical health. Legal oversight, while necessary, often intervenes after the fact. Grievances, court filings, and federal monitoring provide documentation, but they cannot undo the immediate impact of restrictive conditions or procedural missteps. Settlement agreements and oversight reports serve as acknowledgement that institutional systems failed, at least temporarily, to safeguard those under custody. Despite these failures, systemic reforms have been implemented in recent years. Federal court mandates, policy adjustments, and oversight protocols aim to limit excessive use of isolation and improve procedural compliance. Official documentation confirms reductions in time spent in solitary housing units, enhancements to grievance processes, and training designed to prevent misconduct. Yet the historical record at San Quentin demonstrates that the human cost of overreach is not abstract. It is tangible, measurable, and recorded in legal filings, medical assessments, and oversight reports. Individuals subjected to procedural abuse, delayed care, or retaliatory measures experience both immediate and long-term consequences, effects that continue even after release from restrictive housing. Within these walls, authority is absolute, and the consequences of crossing policy lines are profound. The architecture of San Quentin, the rhythms of control, and the structured hierarchy of correctional staff all converge to create an environment in which accountability, oversight, and human well-being intersect in complex ways. It is this intersection, the balance between order and overreach, that defines life inside California's most closely watched prison. And it is here, in documented cases and verified records, that the full measure of the human cost becomes visible. Every delayed response, every procedural violation, and every misuse of authority leaves an indelible imprint, not only on the individuals directly affected but on the institution itself, its credibility, and the broader understanding of what it means to confine human beings under strict control. Reflection on authority and confinement. San Quentin stands as a testament to the tension between control and human vulnerability. Within its walls, correctional authority is exercised daily, often without public witness. The structure of the institution demands compliance, but it also magnifies the consequences when lines are crossed. The cases documented in public records, court filings, and federal oversight reports show that even trained, professional staff can overstep boundaries. When that occurs, the impact falls on the individuals living within the cells, often silently, always enduringly. The human cost of authority exercised beyond policy is both immediate and lasting. Psychological strain, disrupted routines, and diminished autonomy are woven into the fabric of daily life. At the same time, the institution has mechanisms to review, document, and correct misconduct. Settlements, disciplinary actions, and oversight protocols provide accountability, even if delayed. San Quentin's history, architecture, and operational realities illuminate a fundamental truth of confinement. Power, when concentrated, carries profound responsibility. Mistakes, abuses, and procedural violations are not merely administrative failures. They are lived experiences for those confined. And in these corridors, beneath the flickering lights and behind reinforced steel doors, the weight of that responsibility is visible, silent, and enduring. For those who walk these tiers, both staff and inmates, the balance between control and humanity is constant, precarious, and inescapable. Comments, reflections, and dialogue about these realities are essential. Share your perspective. Like, comment, and subscribe to continue following the documented truths from within California's most scrutinized prisons. Studio Microphone True Crime File, where the truth can't be locked away.